Hello family, welcome back to our channel, where we delve into the untold stories of history and explore the impact of past events on our present. Today, we're tackling a topic that continues to affect millions of people across the African continent: mental colonialism. Unlike physical colonialism, which involved the forceful occupation of African lands, mental colonialism attacked the very essence of African identity. It sought to reshape the African mind, to make Africans feel inferior, and to impose foreign values and beliefs that would dominate their lives for generations. Join us as we uncover how this psychological war was waged, how it suppressed African traditions, and how its effects are still felt today. Before we continue, please take a few seconds and click the subscribe button to join this family. Colonial powers didn't just conquer African lands, they sought to conquer African minds. From the onset of colonialism in the late 19th century, European powers employed a calculated strategy to justify their domination by portraying Africans as primitive, uncivilized, and inherently inferior. This dehumanization was foundational to what became known as the Scramble for Africa, from 1881 to 1914, where European powers divided and occupied nearly the entire African continent. Figures such as Cecil Rhodes, a British imperialist and businessman who played a central role in establishing British rule in southern Africa, openly espoused beliefs in white superiority. Rhodes famously said, "I contend that we are the finest race in the world, and that the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race." This belief was echoed across the European empires and used to rationalize the exploitation and subjugation of African peoples. European scholars, missionaries, and explorers wrote extensively about the supposed backwardness of African societies. Works like Hegel's philosophy of history dismissed Africa as a place without history, claiming that Africans lived in a state of barbarism without the capacity for progress. These ideas were disseminated widely and were often used to educate European and African children alike. Colonial education systems were designed to reinforce this sense of inferiority. Established across the continent, these schools taught African children that their cultures and histories were unworthy of respect. Instead, they were fed a diet of European history, literature, and religion. For instance, in British colonies like Kenya and Nigeria, the curriculum was centered on British history and literature, glorifying figures like Queen Victoria and explorers such as David Livingstone. The heroes African children learned about were not African leaders, but European conquerors. Over time, many Africans began to internalize these messages, believing that their cultures were indeed inferior and that progress could only come through adopting European ways. One of the most powerful tools in the arsenal of mental colonialism was the media, particularly films. European filmmakers produced a vast array of movies that portrayed Africans as backward, primitive, and incapable of self-governance. These films were not just entertainment, they were propaganda tools designed to reinforce colonial ideologies and justify the domination of African peoples. One of the most infamous examples is the 1935 film Sanders of the River, directed by British filmmaker Zoltan Korda. The film, set in colonial Nigeria, depicted Africans as savages who could only be controlled by a benevolent white colonial officer, portrayed by actor Paul Robeson. Robeson, an African-American, later regretted his involvement in the film, recognizing that it perpetuated harmful stereotypes and glorified British colonialism. In Hollywood, African characters were often portrayed as either noble savages or brutal and irrational, reinforcing the idea that Africans were inferior to Europeans. Films like Tarzan, first adapted to the screen in 1918 and popularized through numerous sequels, portrayed Africa as a wild, untamed jungle where white heroes reigned supreme and Africans were either threats or loyal servants. The impact of these films on the global perception of Africa was profound. They shaped how Europeans and Americans viewed Africa, but more importantly, they shaped how Africans viewed themselves. These portrayals contributed to an inferiority complex among many Africans, who began to see themselves through the distorted lens of colonial cinema. The power of these images, repeated over and over again, cannot be underestimated. They reinforced the idea that African cultures were primitive and that progress could only come through emulating European ways. The role of media in mental colonialism extended beyond films to literature, radio, and later television. Colonial governments controlled most of the media outlets in Africa, using them to spread propaganda that glorified European culture and denigrated African traditions. In French colonies, for example, radio broadcasts were used to promote the French language and culture, while dismissing local languages and customs as inferior. This systematic use of media to promote colonial ideologies further entrenched the belief in African inferiority. One of the most insidious aspects of mental colonialism was the suppression of African religions and traditions. European missionaries played a central role in this process as they sought to convert Africans to Christianity. In the eyes of these missionaries, African spiritual beliefs were pagan and demonic, often associating traditional practices with witchcraft and evil. This demonization of African religions was not just about religious conversion, it was about erasing African identity. In West Africa, for example, the Yoruba religion, with its pantheon of gods and rich spiritual traditions, was systematically undermined by missionaries from the Church Missionary Society, who arrived in places like Nigeria in the early 19th century. The missionaries viewed these traditional beliefs as obstacles to civilization and aggressively promoted Christianity as the only path to salvation. Sacred sites were desecrated, and religious leaders such as Babalawas were marginalized or persecuted. Similarly, in southern Africa, the Xhosa people faced aggressive Christianization by European missionaries. The famous Xhosa prophet Nsikana, who tried to reconcile Christian teachings with traditional Xhosa spirituality, was ultimately sidelined as the missionaries insisted on total abandonment of indigenous beliefs. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, which formalized European colonization in Africa, also marked the beginning of intensified efforts to suppress African religions and traditions across the continent. Traditional African religions, which were deeply connected to the land, ancestors, and community, were dismissed as mere superstitions. In Central Africa, the Congo people's spiritual practices were ruthlessly suppressed by Belgian colonialists under King Leopold II's rule in the Congo Free State. The Belgians, infamous for their brutal exploitation and violence, considered traditional Bakongo practices a threat to their authority. The suppression of African religions went hand in hand with the destruction of other cultural practices. Traditional forms of governance, such as chieftaincies and councils of elders, were undermined or replaced by colonial administrations. For instance, in Ghana, then the Gold Coast, the British imposed their own legal and governance structures, sidelining the Ashanti Confederacy's traditional leadership and legal systems. Customary laws and practices were often outlawed or ignored, with European legal systems imposed in their place. This disruption of traditional ways of living further eroded African identities and made it easier for colonial powers to maintain control. Mental colonialism was not just about making Africans feel inferior, it was also about imposing European values and norms. Colonial authorities and missionaries worked to reshape African societies according to European ideals. This included everything from the nuclear family structure to gender roles, work ethics, and social hierarchies. In French colonies such as Senegal and Algeria, the policy of assimilation aimed to turn Africans into Frenchmen in black skin. Africans were encouraged to adopt French language, customs, and laws, often at the expense of their own traditions. The French administration established schools that taught French history and literature, with the goal of creating an African elite that would serve French interests. This policy was epitomized by the évolués, a term used to describe Africans who had adopted French culture and were seen as more civilized than their peers. One of the most profound changes was in the area of education. Colonial schools were established to produce a small elite who could assist in the administration of the colonies. However, these schools were also tools for cultural indoctrination. They promoted European languages, literature and philosophies while denigrating African languages and knowledge systems. In South Africa, under British rule, the Bantu Education Act of 1953 institutionalized a system of education that aimed to prepare black Africans for a life of servitude. The curriculum was designed to teach African students to see themselves as inferior to whites and to accept their subordinate status. The imposition of European values extended to the economy as well. African communal land ownership systems were replaced with European notions of private property. In places like Zimbabwe, then Rhodesia, the Land Apportionment Act of 1930 forcibly removed Africans from fertile lands and confined them to less productive areas, reserving the best lands for white settlers. Traditional farming practices were discouraged, and cash crops, such as cotton, cocoa and coffee, were introduced to feed European industries. The result was a profound disruption of African economic systems and a further loss of cultural autonomy. In Belgian Congo, the introduction of forced labour for the extraction of rubber and minerals was justified as a civilizing mission. The brutal exploitation of African labourers under Leopold II's rule, which led to the deaths of millions, was accompanied by efforts to impose European work ethics and social hierarchies. The Belgians promoted the idea that hard work and obedience to European authorities were the hallmarks of a civilized person, further entrenching the notion of African inferiority. Despite the overwhelming pressure to conform to European norms, Africans across the continent resisted mental colonialism in various ways. The struggle to maintain and revive African identity has been a long and ongoing process, marked by both subtle and overt acts of resistance. In the 20th century, the rise of Pan-Africanism provided a powerful ideological counter to mental colonialism. Leaders like Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, and Leopold Sédar Senghor of Senegal emphasized the importance of African unity, culture and identity in their anti-colonial struggles. Nkrumah, in particular, argued that political independence was meaningless without psychological liberation from colonial mentalities. He advocated for an African-centered education system that would promote pride in African history and culture. The arts also became a battleground for resisting mental colonialism. Writers, poets and artists used their work to challenge colonial narratives and celebrate African identity. Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe's novel Things Fall Apart, published in 1958, is a seminal work that critiques the destructive impact of colonialism on African societies while highlighting the richness of pre-colonial life. Achebe's work, along with that of other African writers like Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who wrote Decolonizing the Mind in 1986, played a crucial role in challenging the dominance of European cultural norms. In more recent times, the decolonization of education, religion and cultural practices has become a major focus of African intellectuals and activists. Movements like #Rhodes Must Fall and #Fees Must Fall in South Africa have called for the decolonization of university curricula, the removal of colonial symbols, and the promotion of African knowledge systems. These movements have inspired similar efforts across the continent to rethink education and reclaim African perspectives. There is also a growing resurgence of interest in traditional African religions and spiritual practices. In Nigeria, for instance, the Yoruba IFA religion has experienced a revival as people seek to reconnect with their ancestral heritage. In Tanzania, the government has promoted the use of Kiswahili as a national language, asserting cultural independence and rejecting the dominance of European languages. Mental colonialism may not be as visible as the physical occupation of lands, but its effects have been just as profound. The systematic attempt to reshape African minds, to make Africans feel inferior, and to impose foreign values has left deep scars that are still healing. However, by understanding the mechanisms of mental colonialism and actively resisting its legacy, Africans can reclaim their identity and take pride in their rich cultural heritage. The struggle to decolonize the mind is ongoing, But with each step, Africans are reclaiming their voices, their stories, and their future. Thank you for watching, and if you found this video informative, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content on the untold stories of history.